This is Franchise Today, brought to you by FRM Solutions, providers of the best-in-class software solutions for franchise relationship management. Franchise Today is your destination for weekly information, conversations, and interviews with accomplished industry leaders, all of whom share best practices for sustainable growth and sensible franchising. Here now, your host, Stan Friedman, to kick off this week's podcast.
Today is Wednesday, July 17th, 2024. I'm Stan Friedman, and this is Franchise Today. Last week, I delivered part one of a two-part special featuring liquidity events that may seem magical or possibly even too good to be true. Why? Well, imagine being able to achieve your liquidity event without giving up a stitch of equity, much less most or all of it. Imagine remaining in leadership of your brand instead of being relegated to a middle-level management position, employed by your new private equity partner/employer. As Sean Morrison, president of Canada's Diversified Royalty Management, spelled out for us last week, certain qualified founder-led franchise brands can actually have their cake and eat it too by cashing out while staying in. And by staying in, I mean remaining in complete control and ownership of the business while scoring a liquidity event monetizing their current royalty base at multiples equal to or even better than those with private equity, and doing so keeping 100% of their upside as well, rather than walking away and leaving too much on the table. True, this plan does have some stringent qualifiers and is not a present-day option for everyone, but today we'll hear from someone who this did work for, despite his healthy respect for private equity. In fact, David Earl, CFO at Stratus Building Solutions, was flirting with nearly a dozen pitch decks trying to find the right PE partner when by happenstance, he stumbled into the world of royalty transactions as an alternative to PE. While at first David thought, nah, this is too good to be true, what he discovered following some arduous due diligence was that Diversified's program was not only real, but in fact, a much more desirable option for the Stratus partners. Now, he's here today to walk us through it all from the franchisor's point of view. Get ready, America, to learn how this cutting-edge program worked for Stratus and how you may be able to position yourselves down the road for just such an option as well. Knowledge is power, and when I return in 2 minutes or less, that power is headed your way. I'm Stan Friedman. This is Franchise Today. Don't go anywhere. David Earl is coming right up. Stick around.
Franchise Today will be right back, but first, a word from our sponsors.
We are all familiar with Vistage, YPO, and EO. Well, now comes Zor Forum, a somewhat similar type of executive group, but this one comes with a twist. Zor Forum groups are exclusively for franchisors. Imagine a peer group for sharing and networking on a platform built exclusively for franchise executives. Zor Forum members are afforded unparalleled access to best practices and some of the brightest minds within the franchising world through regular meetings and a dedicated communications platform. In this post-COVID world, a franchise-specific mastermind or peer group is an endeavor worth making time for. Zor Forum groups of 6 to 10 will bring leaders together that are in similar situations, but with exclusivity in terms of their competitive sets, so that each can openly help others benefit from their respective knowledge, perspective, and experience with no fear of competitive loss. Network, learn, strategize, and remain motivated along your journey. Join a peer group, not just any peer group. Join the only one designed for emerging franchisors. Join Zor Forum. Learn more at zorforum.com. That's www.zorforum.com. David Earl is CFO at Stratus Building Solutions, the fastest growing provider of green commercial janitorial services in the USA. In 2020, Stratus brought David on in preparation for their search for the right private equity partner. David has a deep understanding of and affinity for private equity, especially for companies on the fast track like Stratus. While on the threshold of making a decision after months of private equity pitches, COVID hit and Stratus decided to hit the brakes and see how much the world might change post-COVID. It was during those moments in time that they by chance learned about Diversified Royalty and ultimately pulled the trigger with them instead. David is here today to tell us all about what that looked like and how it feels today. David Earl, welcome to Franchise Today.
Thank you, Stan. Glad to be with you.
Glad to have you aboard to share part 2 of a very special 2-part series. So last week we heard from Sean Morrison, President and CEO at Diversified Royalty, and learned about the world of royalty transactions as a substitute for those founder-led brands that might be considering private equity and giving away too much of the store. And quite an interesting conversation. And of course, I was made aware that Stratus Building Solutions is a company that has already taken part in the transaction with Diversified. So we learned all about it from the guy who's pitching it. But what we get to today is the unpacking of what it felt like for you as a franchise brand to experience this and what it felt like different from private equity, which I understand you've looked at more than one pitch in that realm as well. Before we unpack any of that, though, we always start the same way, David, and that's with me asking my guests to tell us where you were and what you were doing when franchising and you made the connection.
Sure. Yeah, we were the first U.S. deal that Diversified did. So it was new territory, certainly for me. I had started out my career in Hollywood, working for studios for about 15 years. And after that, I took the leap to private equity and was fortunate enough to be with the company that they used as a flagship, and they built off of that company with multiple acquisitions, 21 acquisitions to be exact. And we grew the business using the private equity model. And after a couple sales, and I decided to exit and was looking for my next gig, if you will. And just like you had said, franchising kind of found me. I was looking and I had met Afshin, and the corporate headquarters is literally 3 minutes from my house. So I thought, how is that possible that this opportunity to jump into a brand that's growing so quickly and kind of fits my history of experience as far as growth be right around the corner for me? So I had never been in franchising. So in essence, franchising found me, and here we are today.
What year would that have been?
That was 2020. January 2020.
And so your background is finance. So what role did you join in? Did you join as a CFO?
I joined in as CFO, correct. They were looking for someone to take them to the next level and put some formality in the Office of Finance and in preparation to go to market.
So walk us from there through some of the milestones that have occurred since 2020. What a marvelous year to start a new gig, right?
Yeah. COVID had actually just hit. We were getting the company ready to present to whoever would be interested in a monetization. And at the time, we were entertaining private equity groups. And so I came in and formalized their forecasts and their finance deck in order to present the pitch and the pony shows that will have to be done to the private equity groups. So we worked through that and ultimately sent out the package to many private equity groups. And obviously you don't always get bites from that, but we ended up presenting to 8 private equity groups. And that was in mid 2020.
And so what was the experience of going through the private equity pitch process? I mean, no two private equity companies present themselves as the same. I think most all of them are a 5-year plan, but well, except maybe Work Capital. But what do you guys talk about after each pitch? What do you see? What do you feel? How do you diagnose what you've just experienced?
Yeah, that's a great question, because private equity, which I personally am a fan of, I enjoy the amount of expertise and capital that they bring to the table. I like high growth companies. You know, it keeps you busy when you're growing. So I was a big fan of private equity before we had engaged ourselves with Diversified. And those pitches that you come out with, you meet the management group and you get to know their culture. And does the culture fit in with how you're expecting to grow the business? And how many board seats are they going to have? How much control? So most of the concerns are not really around how they'll grow the business. It's around the cultural impact that private equity will have and where the partners will play the role in the company after private equity. So the concerns were how much control, who has the say, who's the final decision makers? Will the partners be sunsetted? Do they have to roll forward their equity? How long will they have to stay? Most of the horizon on the exit that we were seeing were 5-year exits. So that's a very common exit for private equity. So we were pleased with that. And most of them, I'd say probably 5 came down with letters of intent. And all 5 were culturally a good fit as far as management. But again, they were losing complete control of the ultimate decision, and they were losing the growth, the opportunity to monetize the growth of their company, because Stratus Building Solutions is on the growth side, right? They're not at the pinnacle yet of their growth. So there was a lot of upside to be left on the table, and that was a major concern for them.
One of the things that I talk to CEOs and franchisor founders about an awful lot lately, with all of the roll-ups and consolidations and portfolios and umbrella companies that have been just pervasive since COVID, we have conversations around that word culture that you brought to us here today as well. My concern is a founder-led company has built a culture around him being the founder or she being the founder of that company. And when private equity comes in and 80 or 90% of control of the business changes hands, suddenly that leader is not a leader any longer. He's an employee or a middle-level manager at best, right? Rolling up and reporting to private equity. There's got to be massive changes that the founder goes through that is felt downstream. What's your thought on that?
I totally agree. It's hard to keep culture, is certainly when it's embedded from a longevity of a partner-owned company. One of the things that I personally experienced and witnessed was working with private equity and the owners of the companies that we had bought. And a lot of them, sure, they got maybe a high level salary and position, but they were scraped of their vision. They were scraped of their entrepreneurship, if you will. And I saw them, a lot of them were just floating around and eventually would leave because inside their entrepreneurship spirit was dampened. And so the culture they put into their companies, they weren't able to put their stamp on it once private equity stepped in, because private equity has obligations for return. And if you're not reaching those goals, then changes have to be made. And so culturally, sometimes, and not all the time, culturally, you lose that spirit that the partners have put in and have mentored into their companies.
I guess the other side of that coin is, as you said too, about high growth, the opportunity to do things with the infusion of capital that was not readily available prior to the transaction certainly ratchets up the opportunity for that brand to bring on professional tools and management and do things that change the game in terms of the level of play, correct?
It is. And that's a good insight, because they want usually best of best practices, right? And so some decisions that are made and the culture that is created is because of the amount of capital and level of formality, if you will, and the level of senior management. So private equity comes in with a lot of capital. They'll put in there the high level strategic vision type employees. And sometimes that will flow down as a cultural change amongst the lower level management and other employees of the company. So I can see why private equity does that, right? Because they have done it. It's a mousetrap that's already been built, and it has success rates within that confine that they construct their companies with once they put capital in. So it does change culture because you're creating a hierarchy that wasn't there before.
What about the process and how long it takes for each of these pitches from front to back? What's the timeline? How much distraction does that cause you in the business?
Yeah, for the pitches to the private equity groups and the preparation for that.
Yeah.
So it takes a horrendous amount of effort, actually, because you're going to have to convince an individual or a group of individuals that what you're projecting is accurate. So not only from a financial forecasting standpoint, but the solutions and the ideas that will get you to that forecasted numbers. So the sales teams have to be on board. Certainly the partners have to have the same story that finance does, and they have to have their input so that this forecasted number has a roadmap of how we're going to get there. Historically, they're looking at historical growth rates, and those are already in the can, right? We know what you're growing at. So that helps because in a high growth company, you already have that historical record, and the private equity is coming in and saying, will you continue that astronomical growth? Because if you do, this is a win for them. But they'll come in and pick apart those forecasts and your solutions. And so you have to be well prepared to pivot in those conversations when they come and try to poke holes in that model. So there is a lot of prep work. I'd say we prepped probably 90 days out, and that's with using a professional broker who helped us with our pitch decks and was able to present ourselves in front of the right equity firms.
And you did this how many times?
We did this 8 times. We had 8 deck pitches that we did, but it goes out to a lot more than that. And then it whittles it down, and we did it 8 times.
And then, of course, the other piece that you just kind of articulated is that whatever multiples of EBITDA that they are going to offer you is based on the historical numbers. And then their real profit comes from the upside if you hit it, right?
Yeah. So that's from an ownership standpoint, that's the giveaway. That's the bad part about private equity. You certainly can walk away with a nice monetization of what you've created, but depending on where you're at in the life cycle of your business, you could be leaving a ton of money on the table that is going to be given to the private equity because they're taking the next risk, right? They've paid you a multiple, and so they have bought your upside. And that's one of the major drawbacks of private equity.
All right. So we understand now what it is you experienced going through this 8 times and looking at private equity. Why don't we take a quick break? And when we come back on the other side of that break, let's talk about how you and Sean Morrison got together and how you learned of this opportunity to monetize existing royalty without giving up any of that upside potential. And we're talking today with David Earl, CFO of Stratus Building Solutions, the leading provider of green commercial janitorial services. And he and his company have participated in a transaction with Diversified Royalty, first transaction with Diversified Royalty in the U.S., where it is a novel idea, but it's been done for 20 plus years in Canada. And we're going to learn more about the experience on the other side of this break. I'm Stan Friedman. This is Franchise Today. Don't go away. We're coming right back.
Franchise Today will be right back. But first, a word from our sponsors.
Franchise Today is brought to you by FRM Solutions, offering the only CRM tool built exclusively for franchising that lets you have it your way. Whether you're a single brand needing professional tools across departments or a portfolio of brands needing franchise-specific CRM across the enterprise. Either way, FRM satisfies the needs of many with the power of one. That's right, one single instance of FRM is all it takes across departments or across brands. So if you've had it with inflexible, one-size-fits-all CRM, end your frustration today. FRM offers robust dashboarding, tailored reporting, and with open APIs, FRM pushes, pulls, and integrates with other databases, providing you with a single source of truth. Don't just take my word for it. Visit them at frmsolutions.com and order up a demo today. And we're back with David Earl, CFO at Stratus Building Solutions. So we've got a good foundation from you, David, on your experience with private equity. Then Sean Morrison comes along. How did that look? And tell us about it.
Yeah, it was like a coincidence here on meeting Sean and the Diversified Group. We were at the International Franchise Association convention in 2020. And one of our partners who's Canadian was walking the floor. And on the corner aisle, there was a booth that didn't have any special bells and whistles, right? And Sean and Greg were sitting there, and the partner hit it off with Sean and them because he's Canadian and they're Canadian. And so that kind of started the conversation. And so he talked to them for many minutes. I think it was like 30 or 40 minutes. And then he got back to the partners and myself who were walking other parts of the floor. And he said, "Hey, I met this gentleman named Sean, and he's got this interesting idea on how to monetize our EBITDA." And the interesting thing about this was the timing of all of this, right? This was in March, and we were doing pony shows for private equity in June, July. And so we kind of tucked this intro to ourselves. And when he first approached us, it was just like, okay, he's telling us that you can monetize EBITDA and not lose control of your company. And so my first knee-jerk reaction was, that's not possible. That's not how this this works. And so he brought us over to the booth where we started our conversations up with Sean. And sure enough, he was very excited about it coming into the U.S. He had done it many, many times in Canada. And the Diversified group was looking to expand into the U.S. for their first deal. And so I remember going back and thinking to myself, this is too good to be true. We really need to do our due diligence if we pursue this. And then subsequent to that, we had conversations, but the private equity groups were coming in front of us and we had a lot of work to do. So it wasn't at the top of our priorities to investigate that yet. So after we had talked to the private equity groups, and because of the COVID, COVID kind of was putting a wrench in things as far as a lot of places were closing. We didn't know where the commercial space was going to end up. And obviously we do commercial space cleaning. And so we wanted to put this thing on hold a little bit. We wanted to show more value in the company and assure the private equity groups that we are surviving COVID. We're pivoting. We're doing special cleaning and disinfecting, which actually quadrupled that year. And we wanted to show value so that we would get the multiple that we needed. And while we took a pause on all of this, we started entertaining the diversified model.
And how does that look as compared to the multiples that you would be receiving with private equity? Are those numbers pretty similar?
Yeah, they actually were slightly higher than the multiples that we were going to get from private equity. And, you get different multiples from each group, but they were all around in the same ballpark. And Diversified was actually extremely competitive in multiple.
So how did you analyze this when your first impression was this is simply not possible? It's not how it's done. What kind of due diligence did you enable yourself to take part of and almost have to suspend disbelief, didn't you, that this was real?
Right. They were coming in and saying, hey, this model allows you to monetize your current EBITDA. And what it allowed them to do is retain complete control of their company. And also the fact that in the future, as you grow, and this model obviously works well with high growth companies, that's why it's lucrative for both sides, is that you get to monetize any upside EBITDA after you climb a couple hurdles. And I was like, we really have to be cautious. I was advising the partners, like, let's really look at this and do our due diligence. And so the first step that they did is engage previous company CEOs and ownership that went through their deal, just like this in Canada. And sure enough, there was a positive feedback from the ones that they spoke to. And then we went into reading some of their deal structures and some of the legalese, if you will, and the obligations and what the deal would start to materialize with as far as ownership of trademarks, board seat control. What is it that the financing deal structure is going to be? And what are the obligations of the company once that monetization takes place? So we engaged legal teams and tax attorneys, national legal teams and international tax teams to really look at this deal, because as in private equity, they come in and they buy out stock, right? They're purchasing equity. And so it's a capital gains play that has a different rate, obvious in the tax codes. What this was not really buying equity. And so we had to make sure that the taxing strategy would be beneficial to the partners, just like private equity is. And we were able to work with these international tax teams and legal attorney teams that structured the deal and confirmed that, yes, this can be treated as a capital gains taxing strategy. And that was one of the biggest hurdles, is getting that right between a Canadian purchaser and a U.S. seller. And so we were able to work all through that. And believe me, that was a big undertaking. And lots of people had their hands in making sure that that was going to work out correctly.
And I want to circle back on what I think I heard you say. I want to make certain I heard it correctly, that you can actually go back for a second, third, or fourth bite of the apple after your growth does take the lift that was anticipated or greater, that you can actually go back and remonetize again?
That's correct. There's several benefits of working with the Diversified Royalty Corporation, and their model is the first one is the minimum reporting obligations. Whereas private equity, you're jumping a lot of hoops and doing a lot of reporting and covenants because they've leveraged your company and so forth. Working with Diversified is very minimal reporting obligations. They have quarterly requirements and run rate EBITDA models that you have to show that you're hitting targets, but they're really non-invasive in that respect. And the second thing is obviously retaining of the ownership of the company, retaining control. And the fourth one the big one is the option to monetize future growth. So if you're obviously once the deal is struck and you've monetized your initial EBITDA, depending on how fast you grow, you have opportunity to monetize future tranches of EBITDA. So they set a floor for you. And if you go above and beyond that floor with a certain holdback amount to be able to cover working capital, they allow you to monetize again and again. And I know several of the Canadian companies that have been involved with them have already done that. And we are looking forward to doing that as well.
That sounds to me like the perfect definition of what Sean described as you get to have your cake and eat it too.
That's a good rendition of that. Yeah.
So with private equity, you could get an earnout, but that's a one-time shot, right? You overperform on whatever the deal was and you may make a little more, but you can't come back and say, I want to do it again, can you?
No. And private equity, they are really good at identifying companies that have great upside potential. And they'll go in and they're going to step on your forecasts and really carve out stuff that aren't in your run rates in order to reduce the multiple or the EBITDA that they're going to buy out. And then if they do that, then they've bought out at a little bit of a lower rate and you don't get any of the upside. Their investing group gets all the upside once they exit in 5 years. But in this case, you as partners and still owners get to work with the Diversified to actually monetize over and over any available EBITDA instead of the private equity groups taking it for themselves.
There's one thing that I caution people who are looking to buy a franchise. In all the years that I was in franchise development, I always said to prospective franchisees that you have to be in complete alignment with what you're about to do. Both the left and the right side of your brain need to be in sync. And if they're not, you're not ready to do this yet. What do you say to a franchisor who also has a left brain, right brain problem when they're getting ready for the lure of private equity and they're being courted with private equity people wanting to talk with them about an infusion of capital and a liquidity event, and they get to a place where I think they too go to one side of the brain. They get all excited about the money, but they don't think about the other side of the brain in terms of what it means to the business, what it means to the existing culture. So what is it you tell an audience that's tuned into this conversation today, David? If there was one thing that you could counsel them to consider and think about and be sure that both sides of the brain are in lockstep before they get involved in considerations like this, what would that be?
That would be to maintain the brand that you've created. If you're going to do a deal, is your brand going to suffer? Because you've put your heart and soul into your brand, this franchise. And obviously, private equity is coming knocking on your door because you have success. And that success has been built on a brand. If you get into the left and right brain thinking, the emotion, and emotion starts to get into it because you see dollars being thrown at you. The question you need to step back and ask yourself is, this brand that we've created, is it going to have longevity and become the company that we envisioned from the beginning? And if you can't say yes to that, then I think you need to step back and ask yourself, is this the right play for you as far as giving your company up or stepping back and selling it to private equity?
You've been so insightful here and helpful in rounding out this conversation that began a week ago on the other side of the coin. David, are there any questions or anything that I didn't ask you today that you think I should have?
No, I think we covered the whole journey of private equity versus this opportunity that the Diversified Royalty Corporation is providing. And to wrap it up, I would say that the partners and ownerships of these companies have opportunity when they become successful. And you really need to take a step back and talk amongst them, the ownership, talk amongst themselves and understand just what they're looking for and what they are willing to give up culturally, control-wise, and brand, recognition-wise. And that'll help them cut through some of that left-right thinking to be able to make the right decisions, because successful brands and companies are going to have opportunity, and you want to make the right choices when that comes.
I think Stephen Covey called that beginning with the end in mind.
I haven't heard that one, but I'll remember it.
7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I don't remember which habit it is, but it's one of those 7. David Earl, it's been a real pleasure having a conversation with you today, and I can't let you get away without giving some contact info for those in the audience that may choose to circle back and get you for some more information offline.
Sure. They could reach me on my LinkedIn. I'm all over LinkedIn. You can find me there, David Earl, and feel free to ping me a private message, and I'll be happy to get back to you and create relationships via LinkedIn.
Wonderful. David, thanks again for joining us. You've heard today from David Earl, CFO of Stratus Building Solutions. Thanks for being here.
All right. Thank you, Stan.
Well, that's a wrap for this week. Next week, we remain in the world of PE and liquidity, as we'll be joined by Alicia Miller, strategic advisor to franchise founders, leaders, and investors, a top 100 franchise influencer, franchise investor, and #1 best-selling author of Big Money in Franchising. Alicia is also the founder and managing director of Emergent Growth Advisors. Emergent serves private equity firms, franchisors, as well as multi-unit franchisees to find and make smart franchise investment decisions, develop actionable value creation plans, and to realize operational improvements, driving significant increase in enterprise value. Emergent's advisory experience spanned both PE-backed brands and PE-backed multi-unit operating groups. Emergent also supports emerging and re-emerging brands to significantly improve enterprise value, commanding both quality prospective franchisees as well as private capital attention. Alicia Miller, right here next week on Franchise Today. Until then, I'm Stan Friedman, wishing you the best, the very best of all things franchising, and Franchise Today is out.
Franchise Today is a production of FRM Solutions, providing best-in-class CRM tools to empower relationships with prospective and existing franchisees. Find them online at frmsolutions.com. Join Stan every Wednesday at noon Eastern for another episode of Franchise Today.
When it's PCS time, you know the drill. Pack, research the new base, get the kids in school, because family supports family. At American Public University, we support military families with flexible, affordable online education that moves with you. As a military spouse, your tuition rate is the same as your partner's, just $250 per credit hour. American Public University, education that moves with you. Learn more at apu.apus.edu/military.